All right, back to Ezekiel. We had at least given the framework of what is seen in Ezekiel chapter 24 through 33:20. We spoke about the fact that Ezekiel chapter 24 is dated at the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. We've already read in verse 2, this very day the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem. And the image of God's judgments as the boiling pot coming upon Judah, coming upon Jerusalem, is once again taken up, a reminder of what we've already seen in Jeremiah chapter 1, the pot that is going to come upon all of the nations, including Judah. Well, now historically is where that desolating judgment is going to come upon Jerusalem. And God is vindicated in doing this because of the filthiness, because of the iniquity and sin of his people. And so in verse 16, Ezekiel is told by the Lord that I am about to take from you the desire of your eyes with a blow, but you shall not mourn and you shall not weep, and your tears shall not come. Groan silently. Make no mourning for the dead. Thus, verse 24, Ezekiel will be a sign to you according to all he has done. When it comes, then you will know that I am the Lord your God. And so, Ezekiel here mirrors Yahweh, who, though obviously moved by what is going to take place in Jerusalem, does not outwardly show any signs of his grief, any signs of mourning, because obviously for Jerusalem this is a deserved consequence because of their sin. And the Lord was about to profane the sanctuary, and in the same way as Ezekiel was going to have the blow of losing his wife, Yahweh was going to have the blow of losing his sanctuary within the land. And in verse 25 to 27, as for you, son of man, will it not be on the day when I take from them their stronghold, the joy of their pride, the desire of their eyes, their heart's desire, their sons, their daughters, that on that day he who escapes will come to you with information to your ears. That when this destruction of the city, the sanctuary, takes place, one is going to escape and bring news to Ezekiel on what has taken place. And verse 27, on that day, when you receive the news of the destruction of the temple and of the city, your mouth will be open to him who escaped, and you will speak and be dumb no longer. Thus you will be a sign to them, and they will know that I am the Lord. All right, now, Ezekiel, once again, just as we already saw in chapter 3, all right, silence. You're not going to speak any more concerning the situation about Jerusalem until the destruction of Jerusalem has taken place. In fact, it is going to go beyond that. Your tongue will be loosed at the time when the news will come to you concerning that destruction. And of course, when that news comes before the exiles in that historical situation, and obviously we, as we're reading the book of Ezekiel will be vindicated as a true prophet of Yahweh. His word will have been seen to come to pass. And it's going to be very, very interesting that as a vindicated prophet, when we come to chapter 33, that as he opens his mouth to give further words to Israel in exile, it will be words of restoration. It will be what the Lord is going to do to then restore the fortunes of Israel in the future. And yet at this point, all right, with the end of chapter 24, and we'll wait until we get into chapter 33, when Ezekiel, to a certain extent, will be recommissioned and his tongue will be loosed to once again speak to Israel. All right, with, if I put it this way, enforced silence concerning Israel in chapters 25 to 32, he turns and communicates to the nations. Now, chapter 25 is under the same chronological statement, chapter 24, verse 1. Then in chapter 26, he just says broadly that it came about in the 11th year in the first of the month. All right, the first of what month? You got 12 to choose from. So somewhere between 587 to 586 BC, the word of the Lord comes to him and will give 3 chapters concerning Tyre. And then in chapters 29 to 32, we'll kind of have, might put it this way, chronological hopscotch as Ezekiel brings together a number of oracles that are given to him over a number of years, from 587 all the way to 571 BC, concerning Egypt. And we will not go blow by blow through that. I would commend to you Alexander's work in Exposited Bible Commentary, who takes those chapters and shows how, as you take a look at it chronologically, how that helps historically what was taking place to understand what was in the oracles originally as Ezekiel gives them, and then seek to bring together the fact and basically the big idea that Ezekiel gives concerning Egypt is Egypt, you're trying to withstand Babylon and it's not going to work. In the end, God is going to bring his judgment upon you. You are resisting. You are seeking with all of your might to resist the Babylonians, but God is superior to your strength, superior to your power, and he is going to bring his judgment upon you. Well, that's broadly what is in chapters 29 to 32, but let's come back, because in chapter 25, the Lord deals with the nations and begins with these other nations, rights bordering Judah. The Ammonites and the Moabites to the east, the Edomites to the south, southeast, and Philistia to the west. And as you go through this chapter, we realize that as the Babylonians are coming in to the land, God is not only going to execute his judgment upon Judea, but he is going to execute his judgment upon these nations as well. The Ammonites, because they rejoiced because of the profaning of God's sanctuary. Therefore, verse 4, I'm going to give you to the sons of the east for a possession. Moab in verse 8, because they said, behold, the house of Judah is like all the nations. They're just like us. They're no better than us. Therefore, behold, I'm going to deprive the flank of Moab of its cities. Verse 12, concerning Edom, because Edom has acted against the house of Judah by taking vengeance and has incurred grievous guilt and avenged themselves upon them. Aha! We've been under the thumb of the Israelites since David conquered us. There was times when they had gained their independence and then been brought back into subjection. And since they were hostile toward Judah, and when the opportunities came historically, and even when the time when Nebuchadnezzar comes to join in with glee what spoils could be taken from Judah. Therefore, verse 13, God says, I will also stretch my hand against Edom and cut off man and beast from it. And then in verse 15, the Philistines, because the Philistines have acted in revenge and have taken vengeance with scorn of soul to destroy with everlasting enmity. Right? They again are trying to take advantage of Judah's weakness to even the scores of the old against Judah. Therefore, verse 16, I will stretch out my hand against the Philistines. Verse 17, I will execute great vengeance on them with wrathful rebukes, and they will know that I am the Lord when I lay my vengeance on them. Now, you notice each one of these four nations is going to be judged by Yahweh because of an attitude toward Judah. An attitude that rejoices over the misfortunes of Judah and seeks to show their enmity and their hostility and their vengeance against Judah in the circumstances that are taking place. And God says, because of your attitude toward Judah, I am against you, and this is what I am going to do in bringing my judgment upon you. And you really need to recognize that behind chapter 25 is echoing the Abrahamic covenants. Because what were these nations doing? They were disdaining the seed of Abraham. And the one who disdains you says, God, I will curse. And so Ezekiel speaks to these nations that were bordering Judah, and speaks to the situation that they found themselves in, and says, all right, because of the way you're treating Judah, and because what God has said to the families of the earth who disdain will be cursed, then this is what is going to work out upon you. And yet, as we've already said, he leaves his two longest statements to first Tyre for the next 3 chapters, and then Egypt for the following 4 chapters. Now, Tyre was the great city to the north. Obviously, in Israel's history, they had relationships with Tyre. Thanks to Hiram of Tyre, they were able to get the cedars of Lebanon, and the workmen that were involved in the building of the temple. The Tyrians at that point had been in a covenant relationship with David and then Solomon. They were friends of the Davidic house. And what they did for Israel is what Tyre became within the ancient Near East. They became the traders. They became the merchants. They became the ones who trafficked it and merchandised not only to the east, as far as Mesopotamia, but south to Egypt, and of course the Mediterranean became theirs. They were the great seafarers. They had the great boats, and they became the great merchandisers within the 1st century BC. And of course, as today, when you're the middleman, there is a good profit, to be had. And the Tyrians, though they have for a time been friends of Israel, obviously sought to become friends with everybody. That's what merchant people do. They try to stay, on everybody's good side so that they can ply their trade and their wealth and their position had the nation and its king become very, very proud and very, very boastful. And interestingly, the Tyrians, like also the Egyptians, resisted the Babylonians. Resisted the Babylonians to the extent that even though the major part of the city of Tyre was destroyed, the Tyrians actually built a citadel within their harbor, and the Babylonians sought under Nebuchadnezzar to, like they did with other cities, to starve the Tyrians into surrender, and even after a lengthy siege, they were not able to do so. In fact, Tyre was finally not destroyed until Alexander the Great, built a causeway out to the citadel in the harbor and finally took and defeated the city. And so we can see in 26:3, God says to Tyre, "Behold, I'm against you, O Tyre, and will bring up many nations against you, as the sea brings up its waves." What an image for the Tyrians, who basically made their living with their merchandising through their boats. Well, just as the sea brings up its waves, well, in the same way, I'm going to bring up nations against you until you are finally destroyed. Now, you can go through and read it. In chapter 26, we have a proclamation that is given to us through Ezekiel on how God is going to bring Nebuchadnezzar against them. And we're not saying ultimately he would destroy the city once and for all. He would certainly weaken them so that they were not able to ply their trade during his time as they had previously. And ultimately God would bring his judgment upon them and make them a desolate city. Then in chapter 27, having spoken about this, he's already in verse 17 of chapter 26, take up a lamentation, and then goes back in verses 19, 20, for thus says the Lord, 19 through 21, what he's going to do. Basically, chapter 26 is a recounting of God's judgment that's going to come upon Tyre. And then in chapter 27, we see the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel saying, "And you, son of man, take a lamentation up over Tyre." And now, by and large, what we see in chapter 27 throughout the chapter is this funeral dirge that is brought. It's like Ezekiel is a wailing mourner, bemoaning, begrieving what has taken place as far as the city of Tyre is concerned. So chapters 26 and 27 deal with the city itself, the judgment of God, and the lamentation, the wailing in view of the judgment that is going to come. Then in chapter 28, having given these two chapters that deal with the city, Ezekiel now concentrates upon the king. And following the same basic format, in verses 1 through 10, we have a statement of judgment against the leader, the prince of Tyre. And then beginning in verse 11 and through verse 19, we have a lamentation over the king of Tyre. And then he moves on in verse 20 to Sidon, another city that was allied with Tyre at that point, and prophesies judgment against her, and then concludes in verses 25 and 26 of chapter 28, where this is just a prelude, this is just a backdrop to God's ultimate restoration and blessing of Israel, who will be gathered and planted back in the land and dwell securely. And in chapter 28 is where we come upon another major interpretive issue. Now we see that at this point Yahweh through Ezekiel speaks very, very definitely about the judgment that is going to come upon the ruler of Tyre. And the basic sin of the king is pride. Because your heart is lifted up, and you have said, this is the human king, I am a god. I sit in the seat of the gods, in the heart of the seas. Yet you are a man and not God, although you make your heart like the heart of God. Behold, sarcastically, you're wiser than Daniel. Verse 4, by your wisdom and understanding you've acquired riches for yourselves. By your great wisdom, by your trade, you've increased your riches, and your heart is lifted up because of your riches. In other words, you see the wealth that you have and say, this wealth has come because of how brilliant I am. And so my wealth is an indication of my brilliance, and because I am so brilliant, well, I'm like a god. I have that kind of stature. I have that kind of ability. And so this leads to the fact that you are proud. Now, obviously, once we see this proud king, it should remind us of another proud king that we have seen previously. Not the same proud king, but another king whose heart was lifted up in pride. That is in Isaiah chapter 14, the king of Babylon, who is going to be brought low because he himself also thought in his pride that ultimately he would ascend into the heights and become one with the gods, but his end was going to be cast down to the earth. Now the Lord says, beginning in verse 6, because you have made your heart like the heart of God, therefore I'm going to bring nations against you. In verse 8, they will bring you down to the pit. Boy, this should remind you extensively of Isaiah chapter 14. What happened to the king of Babylon in chapter 14 is what is going to happen to the king of Tyre. Verse 10, you will die the death of the uncircumcised by the hands of strangers, for I have spoken, declares the Lord God. Now there is no problem in interpreting this. Every individual says, all right, this is the prince, this is the leader, this is the one who is over Tyre at the time. It is Eth-Baal, the third, as Ezekiel is speaking. And certainly he is the individual who is being spoken of here, that Ezekiel speaks about his coming judgments. Then in verses 11 to 19, we have the lamentation against the king. Son of man, take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre and say to him, thus says the Lord God. Here in the lamentation, in fact, we have many, many hapax legomenas within this lamentation. That is terms that are used nowhere else within the Old Testament. But it's interesting in the lamentation, he says in verse 13, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Verse 14, you were the anointed cherub who covers. Verse 15, you were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you by the abundance of your trade. Again, your heart has been lifted up, therefore you've been cast from the mountain of God. I have destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Verse 19, all who know you among the peoples are appalled at you. You have become terrified, and you will be no more. And with the language that is being used, Eden, and then the precious stones that were the covering, the anointed cherub, the holy mountain of God, blameless until unrighteousness was found in you. You're destroyed, O covering cherub. Your heart was lifted up because of your trafficking. And yet, in the end, you will be judged, and the peoples will be appalled at you.
The description of Satan itself.
That's the interpretive issue. All right, who is Ezekiel lamenting? And from very ancient times in Jewish thinking, and certainly the most predominant position throughout the history of the church has been position D. That at this point Ezekiel is going behind the human ruler and speaking directly concerning Satan. And Dyer, in Bible Knowledge Commentary of those works that I've recommended to you, is the one who takes that interpretive position. So that he would describe it this way. Ezekiel was describing the God behind the king of Tyre. Obviously within the context, Baal. God judged the ruler, the first 10 verses, and the God of the city who empowered the ruler, the one who was viewed by the Tyrians themselves as king over their city. It seems incongruous that Ezekiel would give credence to a mythological tale supporting the ruler of Tyre when much of his book showed the falsehood of pagan beliefs. That is, the Tyranese, the worshippers of Baal, saw behind this a myth that spoke about the god and what was true about the gods. Ezekiel's imagery is drawn from the biblical account of creation, not the mythological pagan mythologies, which basically is held by those who take, some who take position A or position B. His switch from ruler to king and his allusions to the Garden of Eden imply that the individual being described in the lamentation is more than human. The best explanation is that Ezekiel was describing Satan, who was the true king of Tyre, who motivated the human ruler, as seen in the first 10 verses. Right now, that's a classic statement of position D. The change of term And second of all, the language that is used about Eden and the cherub, etc., that this can only be understood as a direct statement concerning Satan. The lamentation is concerning the king. Now we have a very definite problem as we go through Ezekiel, saying that the change in term is saying we are dealing with a different individual. Look ahead to chapter 37, verses 24 and 25. And my servant David will be king over them. Okay, there's Melech, there's the king. But at the end of verse 25, after he speaks about what will take place as David is king over them, and David my servant shall be their not king, but prince forever. So my servant David will be king, and David my servant will be their prince. A king obviously had the idea of one who exercised authority, one who was sovereign, one who was the final word, the final individual within any given nation. Prince has the idea of one who leads, one who stands before. Now, obviously, within the context of what's going to happen when Messiah comes, obviously the true David, the true scion of David, Messiah, is both going to be the ultimate authority and the one who stands before and leads the people. So in other words, you can use the terms of the same individual because it's emphasizing two different characteristics of his position over the people. Therefore, I think to say that because we have a change in term in Ezekiel chapter 28, that now we're going to the true king, we now have a direct statement about Satan, is going beyond the biblical understanding. Obviously, chapters 26 and 27, the city is the same city that receives the oracle of judgment in chapter 26 and the lamentation as that judgment comes in chapter 27. It's the same king, it's the same ruler who receives the word, the lamentation, the song of mourning, the song of grief, as received the oracle of judgments in the beginning of the chapter. So I have moved, if you talk to students from past years, I no longer think that you can really say within the context of Ezekiel that this is a direct statement concerning Satan. So, the majority position has become, as you can see, from the commentaries I've given you, that is just still dealing with a literal king. Craig.
There are also several references throughout Ezekiel to Eden in other contexts. I remember thinking about this as I read through it. I remember thinking that there were other references to Eden. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I'm not sure Eden specifically is said, but the things true about Eden are seen and reflected in some other passages. And obviously, remember back in Exodus, we talked about the similarities between the tabernacle, temple, and the land, and going back to words that were used, concerning the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 2. Remember that chart that I gave you in 501? Well, obviously, because Ezekiel is now talking about a new tabernacle, a new temple within the midst, a return to the land, and speaks, about the land in the same terms that you have within the Torah, then yes, there is echoes of Edenic language, Genesis 2 language, in other places in Ezekiel as well. So yes, and this is also, brought up that that this is not the only place where Ezekiel will use terminology that flows out of Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 within his prophecy. The major position today, as you can see, in fact, Alexander himself, Ralph Alexander, wrote an EBC commentary now out of print in the 70s, where he took the king of Ezekiel chapter 28 and verse 12 as being Satan. By the time he wrote in the 80s, his work in the EBC that I think came out in the very early 90s, he now takes it to be the literal king, and basically talks there about the points within the chapter that had changed his mind. And all of Ezekiel, with more study, he had changed his mind to see it as the literal king. So it's a lamentation about Baal, who, and we've already seen it in the previous verses, is one who viewed himself as a god. Yet I would lean at this point not directly to position A. Now, Merrill in the Biblical Theology of the Old Testament takes position B. This is more actually predominant among non-evangelical writers. He is talking about the king. Now, what is true about A, B, and C is everyone sees that first and foremost Ezekiel is speaking concerning the king. He's lamenting and bewailing the judgment that is coming upon the king. He's taking the place of the mourner and bewailing his fates. But is he saying more than that? Is the human king a symbol or type or shadowing of someone else? Position B says yes. He is like Adam. Adam was in Eden. Adam's sin was what? What did Satan say in Genesis 3:6? Well, he said it to Eve, but Adam also ate. In the day you eat of it, you shall be like God. Right? That's the reason God doesn't want you to eat, because you'll be like God. So what was his sin? Seeking to become like God. What is the basic sin of the king of Tyre? He wants to be God. He considers himself God. And then looks at, all of his wealth. It certainly must come from his wisdom. And very interesting, going back to Genesis. See, here are the echoes again in Genesis chapter 3. When Eve looked, tempted it did tempt her. When she looked at the food, the tree was desirable to make one wise. All right, and so Merrill and others say, all right, you take a look at the imagery that is here, and the imagery is saying, all right, the king of Tyre has succumbed to the same temptation as Adam. So yes, it's speaking first and foremost about the king of Tyre, but the king of Tyre is here symbolic of Adam in the Garden of Eden. That's why you can have the Edenic language that is used here. The only problem with that interpretation is that twice Ezekiel says you were the anointed cherub. Cherub seems to be the covering one, the anointed cherub who covers. You are the covering cherub. And you take a look at Genesis chapter 3, and all right, you have to go very, very broadly. In what way was Adam covering? In what way was Adam guarding the glory of God? Well, of course, you can see where they go with that. Well, this is the broad term for guarding and keeping the garden in Genesis chapter 2. But the exact term cherub is never used of Adam. Therefore, I would say, if you're going to say that behind the language, even though it is a lamentation about the judgment coming upon Etbal III, that if there is any further symbolism within Ezekiel 28, it is not a symbol of Adam, it is a symbol of Satan. Who else could have been the anointed cherub? Who else was in Eden? And, of course, a position as the anointed cherub which was lost because iniquity was found. He was righteous until iniquity was found in him. And, of course, because of his beauty, you corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I put you before kings. And, of course, this is obviously picked up within the New Testament in a passage like 1 Timothy chapter 3. What was the besetting sin of Satan? Pride. In fact, that's why I don't make a new believer an elder, lest he be lifted up in pride and partake of the judgment, the sin and judgment of Satan. But I think we have to say that whatever might be implied by Satan, and Satan within the Scripture is often seen behind men and systems. We'll see that in Daniel 10. We'll see it in Revelation 13, Revelation chapter 16. That certainly when you see a human king, you have echoes of, particularly when you see this pride here, echoes of Satan. But only echoes. And in the lamentation, Ezekiel, and I would go along with Dyer on this, has taken language from the second and third chapters of Genesis and said, all right, I lament you because you also have, in a sense, like Adam, not resisted the temptation of Satan, but what you have done mirrors not so much Adam, but the one who tempted and led Adam astray has also tempted and led you astray too. That is, just as the serpent lurked behind Adam's behavior, then Satan lurks behind the behavior of this human king as well. And you can see that Feinberg and Cooper would take this position. First and foremost, it is speaking about the human king, but realizing that the one whom the human king is emulating in his attitudes and his actions is the tempter, is the enemy of God, who is Satan himself. And I would say that really in the end, the interpretation comes down between A and C, and even those who would take A and C, no statement, no foreshadow, no echoes of Satan within the passage, still say, but okay, understand behind, and we don't want to negate that, behind the actions of sinful men is the influence of Satan. Well, once you said that, can you go further and say, all right, there are evidences and echoes of that in Ezekiel 28. And I would say with the terminology that is used, going back to Genesis 2 and 3, yes, it is an echo that is seen in Ezekiel 28. So in the same way, that Isaiah 14 is about a human king. And as we said, that human king, that king of Babylon, yeah, we see echoes of Satan there. But particularly the fact that he is a king and echoes a king that is Satan's tool that, if anything, he portrays and prepares us for the one who's going to be dominated by Satan in the future. Well, the same thing can be also said here in Ezekiel chapter 28. That the king of Tyre, if he echoes Satan, also anticipates the attitude of ultimately the one who is going to come as the ultimate king established by Satan upon the earth, the one who Revelation will speak of as the Antichrist. So I would lean toward position C. Although, as I say, the majority of contemporary evangelical commentators, as you can see, take position A. Now, they'll come in the New Testament and say, now, when you start to see when Satan is more fully revealed in the New Testament, it's very interesting. You see echoes of what is seen about the human king in Ezekiel chapter 28. But they wouldn't see that in Ezekiel 28. They would just say, all right, you start to see echoes of that when you find out about Satan in a more definitive way, explicit way, when you come to the New Testament teaching. So position A does not negate our Satanology. Understand that. As far as I know, Bloch, DeGuid, and Alexander could all teach, well, I guess Dewey could too, could teach at least the essential part of our course on Satanology. He's all millennial, so he's going to see a little bit more, symbolism even in a passage like Revelation 12 than probably we would. But these are men who, in other words, Satanology does not stand or fall on Ezekiel 28 or Isaiah 14. So I would lean to position C, but do recognize the predominant position today is position A. The predominant position throughout the history of the church, though, has been position D. So there you go. You get all the and if you want to be with Merrill, you can take position B.
I have a hard time understanding the difference between symbolism and double meaning. Because it almost seems like he's speaking to this person as this is what you have done, but it's really not speaking of the kingdom.
Well, no, and those who take position A would emphasize that the one who is being lamented, the one that's being spoken about, is the human king. But as the human king is being spoken of, position C will say, why is this language used about him as a mere man, being in Eden, being the anointed cherub, having and being unrighteous until iniquity was found within him? Why is this kind of terminology used? Because the terminology is echoing, like Adam, the one who has tempted the man to have that kind of attitude. So it's not a double meaning. It is first and foremost speaking about the king. But it is echoing the one who has influenced the king to have that kind of pride that God is going to judge. So I don't want to overblow C. C only gets Satan in within this passage as a mere echo. In other words, the terminology being used is to show that the attitudes and actions of the human king mirror the attitude and actions of Satan. Many in position A say that's taking it too far. All that Ezekiel is doing is using the grandized language that came out of the Canaanites' own mythology that the Tyrians and the king would use himself, and he is turning that against them. And some of that terminology, and this gets to the debate because you got so many unique terms, particularly in verse 13. When you take a look at the different jewels that are used there, and throughout the passage. And so the debate comes: well, if they haven't been used any, other places within the Old Testament, where they come from. And that's those who would lean, well, Ezekiel is turning the language of the king of Tyre against himself at this point. He is using it in an ironic fashion. This is what you believe about yourself, but in the end, it's really not true. So, position A definitely doesn't believe in double meaning, and position C, though some who take that might say there's a double meaning, he's speaking about the human king and Satan. Most would say no, he's speaking about the human king. But the human king who has and reflects the same attitude as Satan, and therefore that is why you're picking up the language that goes back to Genesis 2 and 3. The original temptation, the original desire to be wise, the original desire to be like God. That is now mirrored within the king of Tyre. And so behind it, just like Adam, is the temptation of Satan that the king of Tyre has listened to and has fallen into, just as Adam and Eve. So you can see that even position C has some elements of position B, but it's looking at the tempter, not the fact that the king is just like Adam in all points, just the fact that he has succumbed to the same tempter. All I can say is that, gentlemen, whatever position you hold, obviously, you can't hold it dogmatically. Here are the good and godly men I pointed to you in Ezekiel, and they can't agree. And if in a couple of years I did use the biblical theology of the Old Testament and read actually Dr. Merrill's work on Ezekiel that takes position B. So, in other words, there you got, and you can, if you want to just bracket Merrill in there and realize is Merrill in the biblical theology of the Old Testament. There you go. You've got good and godly men who end up on all four of these interpretive positions. And when it comes right down to it, position D does, within this context, say this is not the human king. I don't think with Ezekiel you can go that far. Position B and C are saying, but there's still echoes, even though it is speaking concerning the king, of the king being like Adam or the king actually being like Satan, because his corruption on earth echoes Satan's corruption in heaven. Okay, those are your viewpoints, and I can now send you the commentaries and say probably before you teach your people Satanology or you go through Ezekiel, probably in pastoral work you probably do the former before the latter. I think most of you will do a survey of doctrine which will include some instruction about Satan from the Scripture before you actually preach Ezekiel. But you better know before you teach your Satanology whether you're going to include Ezekiel 28 as part of that or not, and Ezekiel 14. Without glibly saying, well, this refers to Satan, and then when you preach it, say, well, I guess if I and Ralph Alexander can change our viewpoints, I guess you can too. But every exegetus and every expositor has changed their viewpoint someplace. Leave it at that. It is a major interpretive issue. I've given you the pros and the cons as best I can on all the positions. And like so many other things, you then are left to study and come to your own conclusion. But I will tell you this to encourage you, no matter what position you end up taking, there are good commentators who support you. The bad news is, no matter what position you take, there are good commentators who don't. So in the end, commentaries become tools. You have to make your own exegetical decision. I see a couple of you looking at the MacArthur Study Bible. As far as Dr. MacArthur is concerned, this is Satan. And I think he probably blends toward position C, if I can open that up. He talks about both, and yeah.
How does position A interpret anointed cherub?
Anointed cherub, again, is just using the grandiose language that the king of Tyre was assuming for himself. It's not that he was the anointed cherub, it's using the term ironically. You think of yourself in those kinds of terms, I'll use it about you, but, all right, you're really not, and to show you're not, you've lost that position, and all nations will see when you're judged that you don't have this position at all. All right, and as we can see, we've got the beginning of Jerusalem's judgment with the siege in chapter 24. Then we have, as Ezekiel is dumb concerning, now speaking, he doesn't speak concerning Israel, therefore he speaks concerning the nations. And in chapter 33, the word of the Lord comes to him. Now, no dating is given. It still seems to fall under the time period that is given to us of 585 BC. About again, a commissioning now. Be a watchman. Give my word. Now, we see that he is to give the word so the wicked might respond. Now, why is he to be encouraged? Because verse 17, your fellow citizens say the way of the Lord is not right, when it's their own way which is not right. So when the righteous turns from his righteousness, commits iniquity, then he shall die. When the wicked turns from his wickedness and practices justice and righteousness, he will live by them. Yet you say the way of the Lord is not right. O house of Israel, I will judge each of you according to your ways. All right, again, now you're still part of this corporate entity, and yet I am going to judge each one of you according to your ways. And for the wicked, for those who realize their wickedness and repent, there is the possibility of justice and righteousness becoming a part of his life. And so he is emphasizing here the need for repentance in judgments. If Israel has now gone through the siege, has gone through the judgments, as we will see very quickly they have, then they are to respond to Ezekiel's words in faith and repentance. And this repentance is the foundation for then what is going to be picked up in chapter 33, 21, and following. And so that leads us into the very last division of the book. So you won't be confused. We'll just look at that one by itself. Beginning in chapter 33, 21, we have the two last sections of Ezekiel, that which makes up his third major division. We read in verse 21 of chapter 33, it came about in the 12th year of our exile, on the 5th of the 10th month, we already see January 9th, 585 BC, that the refugees from Jerusalem came to me, saying, the city's been taken. In fact, this is probably, again, not refugees, plural, but a messenger, one who escaped. Now, verse 22, the hand of the Lord had been upon me in the evening before the refugee or the survivor came, and he opened my mouth at that time. They came to me in the morning, so my mouth was opened. I was no longer speechless. Now remember, back in chapter 21, you're going to remain dumb until you hear the message that the city and the temple have been destroyed. Now we see the city has been smitten. Now, the word came the night before. The hand of the Lord had been upon me in the evening. But now, once I hear the word, the mouth is open, so that in verse 23, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, and we're going to see that refrain now come before us 5 more times, as Ezekiel will speak about what the Lord had communicated to him that now he presents to the exiles as the word of the messenger has come. And what does he say? Well, chapter 33, 21 to 39, 29. As we have said, we have this movement that is punctuated by the word of the Lord came to me, saying. And we have these 6 movements. Movements that seem to follow one after another. Now, what we see in the very first word of the Lord, as you can see, is the desolation of the land. Verse 24 of chapter 33, Son of man, they who live in the waste places in the land of Israel are saying, those who have been left behind, not the LaHaye and Jenkins series of that name, those going back to Jeremiah that have been allowed to stay within the land like a Jeremiah under Gedaliah, the few that are there, are saying Abraham was one, yet he possessed the land. So to us who are many, the land has been given as possession. Now compared to Abraham being just one, look, even though we're a very, very small remnant left within the land, look, we're more than Abraham. Therefore say to them, thus says the Lord, you eat meat with the blood, you eat blood, you lift up your eyes to idols, you shed blood. Should you then possess the land? Now, the reminder we've already seen in Kings and Jeremiah, which is that even those that were left within the land after the destruction of Jerusalem have not changed their ways. We already know that they assassinate Gedaliah and in the end will themselves have to leave the land and depart to Egypt and see. They haven't changed. You still are idolaters. You still rely on the sword. You still commit abominations. You still defile your neighbor's wife. You're still in the land, but there's been no change of heart. So, verse 27, as I live, surely those who are in the waste places will fall by the sword. Those in the open field I will give to the beasts. Those in the strongholds and the caves will die of pestilence. I shall make the land a desolation and waste, and the pride of her power will cease, and the mountains of Israel will be desolate, so that no one will pass through. So guess what I'm in the process of doing? Wiping the land completely clean of any Israelites. But as for you, son of man, verse 30, your fellow citizens who talk about you in the walls of doorways, saying, come now and hear what the message is which comes forth from the Lord. And they come to you as people come, they sit, but they do the lustful desires expressed by their mouth. Their heart goes after gain. Behold, to you, you're like a sensual song sung by one who has a beautiful voice, plays well an instrument. They hear your words, but they do not practice them. So when it comes to pass, as surely it will, then they will know that a prophet has been in their midst. All right, now we get to those who are in exile listening to Ezekiel. And to them, it's all just a nice little entertaining song. They're just like the people in the land. Well, let's go hear what Ezekiel has to say today. let's enjoy a little bit of, his words. But they still are sinful people whose heart goes after gain. In other words, the desolation of the land has come and will come completely because of the sinful attitudes of Israel. And whether they are in exile in Babylon, Mesopotamia, or whether they go into Egypt, their problem is exactly the same. They are sinners. So the desolation of the land means total exile. God has done what he said in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. He has scattered them now among the nations, plural. You see, that had to take place. They're scattering the complete desolation because, as we see in Leviticus chapter 26, it is going to be from the nations that Yahweh is going to begin the process of regathering his people back to the land. So the first step that was needed was complete desolation and Israel among the nations. Then chapter 34, then the word of the Lord came to me saying, right, what had brought this to pass? The unfaithful shepherds. So the unfaithful shepherds had led to the sheep, the flock, being dispersed. And so in 34:11, behold, I myself will search for my sheep and seek them out. I'm going to gather them. I'm going to feed them. I will seek the lost and bring back the scattered. Bind up the broken and strengthen the sick. But the fat and the strong I will destroy. I will feed them with judgment. That even in this regathering, all are not going to be regathered. Only the lost and the sick. Those who still view themselves as fat and strong will come under judgment. And in fact, he can say in verse 23, as he delivers them and judges between his sheep and brings the lost and the sick back, verse 23, then I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will feed them. He will feed them himself and be their shepherd, and I, Yahweh, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, Yahweh, have spoken. And I will make a covenant of peace, so that as I bring back the flock under my care, and as they will come under my care, then I'm the one that will protect them. I'll the one that will establish them. I will be the one who will go before them. And so we see here what I call the administration of the Good Shepherd. Now that leads to another interpretive issue. And that is when Ezekiel uses the term David, of whom is he speaking? And a position that has come into evangelicalism, come in particularly to dispensationalism, is that when he speaks here about David being their prince, chapter 37 being their king, that this is literal David. This is the David that is seen in the Old Testament. Dyer takes this viewpoint, following particularly probably the most prominent statement of this viewpoint is in Pentecost Things to Come. This has had sold almost 250,000 copies at this point. Many have been swayed by Pentecost to take the position that this is resurrected David. Now, let me say this very definitely. David was an Old Testament saint. All Old Testament saints are going to be resurrected and have a place within ruling and reigning with Christ in their resurrected bodies. Just as when we come to the New Testament, Revelation 2, Revelation 19, 20, the same thing is also going to be true of New Testament saints. So, as I give my position, I am not denying the fact that David is going to be resurrected. Old Testament David is going to be resurrected. However, that's not who Ezekiel is speaking about, I believe. So I'm not denying resurrection. But they say, well, the term David must mean David. Yes, but David was his throne name. We have no indication of what his personal name might have been. Got to remember, as you read the Old Testament, you are reading a historical account that looks back to David as king. Now, it's very interesting. We saw in 2 Samuel chapter 12, when Solomon is born, that was not his birth name. Solomon was his throne name. Now, I have no problem with, David, but very real possibility, David is his throne name, and therefore, any who sit upon the throne of David, any who after David, according to 2 Samuel 7, are ruler and lead Israel, take the place of David. So when he says, I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David, he will feed them himself and be their shepherd. You know, as you go back to 34:11, Yahweh said, I myself will search for my sheep and seek them out and shepherd them and feed them. And I, Yahweh, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. The one who will be Yahweh's representative, implied, is Yahweh himself. Who, with distinction, Yahweh himself can say, the one I will set over them is my prince, my leader, my ruler. That obviously throughout the Old Testament is the Lord Messiah himself, the one that we now know historically as Jesus. The Lord in Zechariah 14:9 calls himself the king over the whole earth. And so as the ultimate and true David, this is looking to the Messiah. And of course you can see that is the major position held by the commentators of various stripes, that Ezekiel is looking to the future. And though not denying resurrection, he speaks of the fact of this shepherd who is going to be the good shepherd who is going to be the leader, the ruler over his people. And and the fact that Yahweh himself is going to be the shepherd of his sheep. So, with the desolation of the land, it's very interesting. Then, with Israel scattered, the first thing that Israel needs is the new shepherd, the good shepherd. The shepherd who will regather the sheep. Yes, ultimately to plant them back within the land. Now, to plant them in the land. Now the focus has to become upon the land, which it is. In chapter 35:1, moreover, the word of the Lord came to me saying. We'll go all the way through chapter 36, verse 15. And basically in chapter 35, we have a judgment upon Mount Seir. He looks toward Edom. And verse 7, I will make Mount Seir a waste and a desolation. I will cut off from it the one who passes through it. I'm going to bring my judgment upon Mount Seir. And yet, as you turn to the mountains of Israel, now remember, these are the same mountains where idolatry took place, and so were condemned back in Ezekiel chapter 6. Now, God says, all right, look toward the land, look toward the mountains, and God now is going to turn from cursing the mountains to bringing blessing. And so he can speak in verse 8 of chapter 36, but you, O mountains of Israel, you will put forth your branches and bear your fruit for my people Israel, for they will soon come. For behold, I am for you and will turn to you, and you will be cultivated and sown. And so in the future, okay, now you got to realize this point, Edom, all right, as Ezekiel was speaking, was still in Seir. Okay, they're going to be desolate. It is going to be the mountains of Israel that are going to be blessed. And the blessed means that once again, they're going to put forth their crops. That once again, they're going to be cultivated and sown. And men will be multiplied on the mountains of Israel. So once you've got the good shepherd, the next step is the preparation of the land, as the shepherd is going to bring his people into the land, which prepares you then for 36:16. And following, the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, when the house of Israel was living in their own land, they defiled their ways. They were impure. I scattered them among the nations, verse 21, but I had concern for my holy name, which the house of Israel profaned among the nations where they went. Therefore say the house of Israel, that says the Lord God, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, I'm about to act with my holy name, which you profaned among the nations. So what am I going to do? Verse 24, I'm going to take you from the nations. And verse 25, I'm going to sprinkle clean water upon you. You need purification. You're defiled. You're unclean. So I'm going to cleanse you from all your filthiness, from all your idols. And after your cleansing, I'm going to give you a new heart. And verse 27, put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to observe my ordinances. So as I gather you to bring you into the land, that is those who are sick, those that are unhealthy, broken. And now we see the brokenness as a spiritual brokenness. I'm going to cleanse you. I'm going to take out the whole heart, put in the new heart and my spirit, so that you will be obedient from that point point on. Go back to Deuteronomy chapter 30 again. What's the use of bringing Israel in the land if they're going to do the same thing all over again? All right, and so there's going to be not only a purification, but a heart transplant and the power of the Spirit that will allow Israel to walk in the ways of Yahweh. And he goes on through the rest of chapter 36 to talk about the fact they will look back in shame. And here's a place where Craig was speaking about in verse 35, this desolate land has become like the Garden of Eden. And the waste, desolate, ruined cities are fortified and inhabited. Again, we see that what should have and was potential when Israel came in the land the first time is now going to be actuality. You read Genesis chapter 2 of all the bounty and all of the blessing that was in the Garden of Eden. Now it's going to be in the land of Israel as the Israelites come back. And then realize there is no break as you come into chapter 37, 1 to 14. Them bones, them dry bones that are going to come together. According to the Negro spiritual. Well, all right. What are those bones? What is this a picture of? Well, notice verse 11. Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say our bones are dried up and our hope is perished. We're completely cut off. We're just like those bones, them dry bones. And there's no hope, no chance that we will ever live again. Therefore prophesy and say to them, verse 12, thus says the Lord God, behold, I will open your graves, cause you to come out of your graves, my people, and I will bring you into the land of Israel. Then you will know that I am the Lord, when I have opened up your graves, cause you to come up out of your graves, my people, and I will put my spirit within you, and you will come to life, and I will place you on your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken and done it, declares the Lord. And first and foremost, this is not speaking about individual resurrection. This is talking about national resurrection. The bones is Israel. And Israel looks like they're done, finished. No hope. And Ezekiel says, because this is a picture of what I've just been talking about, how God is going to gather you from the nations, cleanse you, put a new heart, spirit, that is a new life within you, and is going to bring you back to the land. And then you will know that I, Yahweh, have spoken and done it, because you had lost all hope that it was going to happen. By the way, that is a reflection of Leviticus 26. You're going to be scattered among the nations. You're going to despair of life itself. You're going to lose hope that there is any future for the nation. This is what Ezekiel is reflecting here. So that when God does it, that's the reason they give up hope. So that when it happens, they realize they didn't do anything to bring it about. You will know that I, the Lord, have done it. And then finally for this morning, when this resurrection takes place, who will be involved? Ezekiel is commanded to take 2 sticks, write on one Judah, write on the other Joseph, Ephraim, the house of Israel. Then join them for yourself to one another into one stick, that they may become one in your hand. This restoration of Israel is going to include both the ancient kingdom of the south, Judah, and the ancient kingdom of the north, Israel. The split that took place under Rehoboam is going to be healed under the greater David. They're going to become one nation again. So verse 21, behold, I will take the sons of Israel from among the nations. Where they have gone, I will gather them from every side, bring them into their own land, and I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountain of Israel, mountains of Israel. And one king will be king for all of them. And they will no longer be two nations. They will no longer be divided into two kingdoms. They will no longer defile themselves with idols. And they will be my people, and I will be my king. And one nation will have what? One king. And by the way, don't miss it in verse 28, one sanctuary in the midst forever to the ages. And what he's saying here is there's going to be a reunification of Israel and Judah in the land. And that northern kingdom who says, what do we have to do with David? Is going to come under again the rule of the house of David. And Jeroboam, who set up the false temples with the false priests, with the false sacrifices, with the false feast, all of that is going to be changed, and now there is going to be not only one king, but one sanctuary. There's just going to be one worship that is going to be followed by all the people of Israel. And by the way, that gets you ready for chapters 40 to 46. What does that sanctuary, what does that worship entail for the one nation in the future? But here is Ezekiel, and he has just gone through now these 5 steps, from total desolation and scattering among the nations to the coming of the Good Shepherd, the preparation of the land for the return of Israel, their return which is seen as a resurrection of the nation within the land, which will be both historically, north and south, now both together are the house of Israel, under one king, one worship system, back in the land at peace. And now we got to wait about 12 days on what's going to happen when they're at peace. Chapters 38 and 39, the invasion of the land by Gog. At the end of this sheet, to show you that this is not just dispensational ranting and raving, and I should say that, this is not just a dispensational understanding of Ezekiel. I have put down blocks, Yahweh's restorative actions for the glory of his name. Now I realize he doesn't see quite the divisions in the same place that we do. But notice again he has 6 movements, just a little different than mine, but 6 movements. And then in 40 to 48, chapter 46 through 46, talking about the temple. And then 47 and 48, talking about the land. And notice again the restoration. The restoration of Yahweh's role as shepherd, the restoration of Yahweh's land, the restoration of Yahweh's honor, the restoration of Yahweh's people, the restoration of Yahweh's covenant, talking about the Davidic covenant of one king, the restoration of Yahweh's supremacy, the restoration of Yahweh's presence among his people, the restoration of Yahweh's presence in the land. Now there's a non-dispensationalist who's read Ezekiel right. So, and yesterday I was reading Ian DeGuitt's work. And you got to remember the NIVAC series has original meaning and then bridging the context and then contemporary application. You read the original reading, you would think you were reading a dispensationalist. Now this guy teaches at Westminster Theological Seminary. He's a card-carrying amillennialist. And then when you see bridging the context and contemporary application, you will start to see it. But as he's talking about what did this mean to Ezekiel and his original hearers, I read that saying, brother, we're on the same page. He talks about the restoration of Israel, and the restoration of the people, the restoration of the kingship, the bringing of the new covenant. All right, I can live with that. Now, of course, and this makes it kind of tough when it gets to, all right, bridging context. Well, now we live this side of the New Testament, so, all right, what is Ezekiel really saying to the people of God? And then we might have some questions, and of course, then when it gets to contemporary application, although he's got some very pertinent points of the principles of Ezekiel at that point. But the Good, an amillennialist, doesn't quite lay out the steps as Bloch, a covenantal premillennialist, does in his commentary. So I give it to you to show, again, this is not just dispensational understanding. This is just a clear reading of Ezekiel.